what the shift will entail. That's what will involve. And my response as a psychologist who's met with lots of people is, I don't think that's going to happen for a lot of people. Because there are steps missing, the steps that I'm talking about. The ego consciousness step, the ego spiritualistic consciousness step, before people can actually get ultimately to their spiritual consciousness. They don't understand ego fully. I mean, totally sold a lot of books, 3.5 million books, The New Earth. But his discussion of ego is negative. In the same way with Dyer. Whenever they talk about ego, the message is it's negative. It's something, according to Tully's message, well, when we make it conscious, it's going to dissolve. And when it dissolves, the door will be open to our spiritual consciousness. That is not going to happen with people's lives, with their ego. Their view is negative. The ego can be your friend. As I say in my book, it can be your enemy, or it can be your friend. You can work with it and develop it in healthier ways so that that ego self, divine self, piece of who we are can merge, and then you can get the moreness out of life. As I mentioned earlier, you want to say something? Okay. There's a lot of people not here. And the reason why they're not here is that leap between unconsciousness to spiritual consciousness does not resonate within the readings that when they read that material, that doesn't make any sense to them. 5 years ago, I had to look over some material in books in doing my book proposal, and I looked at the power of intention. First of all, I want to say this: Tully and Dyer and other metaphysical writers, Carol Oakley, they write really good stuff. Their messages and discussions about spirituality and spiritual consciousness, I couldn't do any better. I wouldn't even try to do it any better. They have an excellent message. Wayne Dyer has excellent things that he has to say about spiritual consciousness and spiritual development. But the one thing they have in common is they attack the ego as the villain. And in fact, the pattern is this: whenever you see a presentation, they bring it up, they attack it, and they discard it. And that's not what's going to happen with people. That our egos are not going to dissolve. If anything, they're going to coexist with our divine self toward that moreness, that spiritual, eventual spiritual consciousness we can get to. So the shift of consciousness is more complex than they've been making it out to be. I have another question, which is, well, who is this shift not occurring for in particular? Who is it not happening for in particular? And I was walking around the grounds here and doing an informal count, and I've come to different expos and conventions with my wife, Linda, who's coming up after me, and I noticed a decided difference between men and women, much more in favor of women who come to these things. And the smallest ratio is 1 to 3, it's often 1 to 5, and it can be 1 to 10. There is a disparity. It's not Nick Martin's opinion. There is a disparity between women and men who are getting that message, who are open to the message of developing their spirituality and their spiritual consciousness. There's something not good about that. And what is not good about that is this is a very important part of you, a very important part of your life. And I think what often happens in relationships is a woman may be growing and developing that piece of who she is, and her partner, if he's a male, just isn't there. They don't get it. It doesn't make any sense to them. Why would you go there? Why would you visit? Why would you, try to get to know that stuff? Because they are asleep. She's waking up, he's sleeping. And this can be harmful over time, I think, in a relationship, because they are growing apart. They are growing apart in terms of this very important part of life. So one might ask, well, why is that? Why are males having a harder time working toward the message of spiritual consciousness and cultivating their spirituality? And the answer I would probably give to you deals with my familiarity with ego and what egos are about. And I'm going to tell you a little bit later exactly what they are. But what I would share with you is that there are really 3 components to a person's ego. And one is the size of our ego. One of it One of them is the permeability of our ego, and one is the fragility of our ego. And our ego size really deals with things having to do with the amount of power, control, influence we want or need to have within our lives. The ego permeability is really the flexibility of your ego. How open are you to learning and new things, different things that may or may not be familiar to you? How well are you able to modify things in your hard drive that may need to be modified? How willing are you to delete things within your mind? So the ego has properties that involve size, permeability or flexibility, and the other one is fragility, which really deals with vulnerability. How vulnerable are you able to be in a healthy human way or not? And unfortunately, males have more issues overall with matters of vulnerability, with coming to terms with their imperfection. Maybe it's part of the socialization we get, that whole John Wayne kind of mental way of looking at emotions, acknowledging, expressing our emotions. So you mix those three areas of ego functioning, and you may have a male has a harder time really connecting to the demands of the ego-spiritualistic and the spiritual consciousness message, which ask you, be more flexible, be more vulnerable, and don't be as heavily invested in having all of the control in your life. Be willing to share it. And I think we can move beyond that, but there needs to be a plan. There needs to be a guide, a map for that to be spelled out with, which is part of what I'm trying to get to and talk about these different consciousnesses. Okay, before I go ahead, does anybody have any questions? I'm going to make sure I'm not too long on my time. You don't have to. By the way, if you don't have any now, I'll be here all day long, and if you want to ask comments, disagreements, clarification questions, or feedback, you're welcome to it. I welcome that. All right, you see on my handout there's a listing of different consciousnesses. Here we go. This one will probably be 4 consciousnesses. And the first one really is what I referred to earlier as really unconscious. Oh, I'm sorry, didn't get any? Sorry. Unconsciousness.
Thank you.
You good?
Thank you.
Sure. Unconsciousness. And by unconscious, I mean, yes, people are mentally alert or awake, but in that egoistic sense, in the spiritualistic sense, they're asleep. They have no understanding and awareness of themselves. Their ego is not immediately something they understand. Knowing your ego is about as easy as knowing what your face looks like without looking in a mirror. You would go through your whole life actually physically being there, but wouldn't know what you were looking like unless you had a sort of reflection. Well, egos are like that too. That's why my book is entitled The Ego Unmasked, because the ego is very well hidden from ourselves. Most people don't really have a full understanding of what their ego is about. Yet, unfortunately, your ego is basically the conduit through which your whole life is flowing. And the nature of your ego will affect your behavior, your thinking, your feelings, your physiology, and even your spiritual well-being. There's an absence of consciousness, ego awareness. Now, don't feel too badly about that, because I'm going to say something else that I think is pretty large and profound. I'm a psychologist. Most psychologists don't know what ego is. They really don't know what ego is. They don't have any consistent, consensual training about what ego is. Yet it's the center of a person's psychological existence. Just like, but a heart surgeon could talk to another heart surgeon about a heart structure, and they could have a consensual conversation in which they could each talk about the valves and the vascular system and the chambers and all of that stuff, and they would each know what the heck they were talking about. Or an auto mechanic, they could be working on the same type of engine, talking on the phone, sharing information, and they would each know exactly what they were talking about in terms of the components and how they work and all those things. When it comes to ego, 2 psychologists could not do that. So if they don't know what it is, how would you know?